Hello and welcome back to Born to Rant. I'm Brandon, and this week we are here to talk about Disney's first attempt at a live-action remake of one of their classic animated films. A movie that features hundreds of real animals, and a movie that's been almost completely lost to time. That's right, today we are talking about how 1994's The Jungle Book came to be, everything that makes it awesome, and its legacy over 30 years later. The Jungle Book is a movie that my family owned on VHS, and I would describe it as an occasional rewatch. It wasn't a movie that I watched on a loop like The Shadow, The Rocketeer, or the Indiana Jones movies, but it was a movie that I would still watch at least a couple times a year. There are a lot of scenes and sequences in this movie that have stayed with me for years. King Louis's palace set alone lives in my brain forever, from the fire to the monkeys, and okay, look, maybe Kaa doesn't look the best in this movie, but still, in the early 90s, this giant CGI snake absolutely horrified me. But not nearly as much as the death of Sergeant Harley, but more on that in a bit. However, as the years went on, I started buying DVDs more and watching VHS tapes less. The Jungle Book was a movie that began to fade from memory. It wasn't one I ever saw playing on TV, we never bought it on DVD, and I never really heard anyone talk about it. This is a movie that if you saw in the 90s, it kind of just lives in your brain because of all the things that make it different from the current run of Disney live action remakes that we've been getting over the last 15 plus years. But before I get too deep into talking about what makes this version of the Jungle Book special, let's go back in time and learn about how this movie came to be. So obviously the beginnings of 1994's The Jungle Book stretch back 100 years earlier to 1894 with the release of Rudyard Kipling's novel The Jungle Book, which was a sizable hit when it was released. Then, in 1967, Disney released an animated film based on Kipling's original stories, and this was actually the last film that Walt Disney ever worked on before his death in 1966. But where I'd really like to start with the origin of 1994's The Jungle Book is with producer Raju Patel, who was the first person to start bringing this movie to life. Realizing that the 100-year anniversary of Kipling's novel was fast approaching, he thought doing a live-action adaptation to celebrate seemed like a great idea, so he secured the rights from Kipling's estate and began working on the movie. However, once Disney's chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg heard about the adaptation and realized that the 100-year anniversary of Kipling's book was right around the corner, Disney secured the distribution rights and contributed about $15 million to the movie's overall budget, making the total budget for The Jungle Book right around $30 million. Initially, Katzenberg also hired Ronald Janver and Mark Geldman, whose only writing credit prior to this was Cyborg 2: Glass Shadow, and those are the only two movies that either writer have ever been officially credited for working on IMDb. And I have to imagine that little of their original script is in the final movie, because their draft was apparently over 180 pages long and there was zero dialogue for the first 70 pages of the script. An actual insane thing to try and turn into Disney, in my opinion. Understandably, Katzenberg and Disney were not exactly psyched on this script, so Stephen Sommers was brought on board to write and direct based on the strength of his work on The Adventures of Huck Finn, which had been released earlier that year in April of '93. And Stephen Sommers is a director you probably know more from the movies he would go on to direct: The Mummy, The Mummy Returns, and Van Helsing. But Sommers was thrilled to be taking on The Jungle Book as his next project. Not only was he a fan of Kipling's original book, but he had also been dying to make a romantic adventure movie set in the heart of the jungle. As for casting, I read two conflicting stories here. One that Jason Scott Lee was always Sommers' first and only choice for playing Mowgli, and another that said that the production did try and secure Bollywood stars from India to play the role of Mowgli. However, because of Bollywood rules and the tight turnaround of production, they were only able to secure Stefan Khalifa and Anurag Agarwal before they'd agreed to any upcoming Bollywood productions. And obviously both of these guys are far too old to have played Mowgli. Apparently, there was quite a bit of pushback from Disney over the casting of Lee. Originally, Disney had a teenager in mind, and at this point, Lee was already 27 years old. However, Sommers was able to convince them that Lee would be a better fit than an unknown teenager, since audiences were already familiar with him from his performance as Bruce Lee in the biopic Dragon: The Bruce Lee Story from 1993. However, it sounds like the rest of the cast slid into place with ease and little to no studio interference, and in late 1993, The Jungle Book went into production, filming on location in India for 8 weeks. And it turns out that the look of the jungle in India didn't quite have the look that Sommers had envisioned, so a lot of the jungle footage was actually shot in Fripp Island, South Carolina, as well as Ozone Falls State Natural Area and Fall Creek Falls State Park in Tennessee. The craziest thing about the production of The Jungle Book is that even with hundreds of animal actors on set, I couldn't find a single instance of any actual animal-related injuries on set, and it's just always nice to hear when movies actually have safe sets. And then after several months of production and post-production, The Jungle Book was released into the world on Christmas Day 1994. And on its opening holiday weekend, it made only $5.1 million and was 7th at the box office. However, the following weekend, The Jungle Book made $10.1 million and was 3rd at the box office, so I think this is just a case of releasing it at the wrong time. The Jungle Book would go on to make a worldwide total of $52.3 million against its $30 million budget, making it a mild disappointment from a theatrical release. One of the most interesting things I learned while doing research for this video is that for the most part, critics quite liked this movie. Even though they all complained it strayed too far from Kipling's original book, they still found it to be a well-made adventure film, and there were more than a few comparisons to the Indiana Jones movies, which I think makes sense given that, again, Sommers would go on to make The Mummy just a few years later. And with all of that out of the way, I think it's time that we dive deep into Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. The movie opens with this long credit sequence over a map of India as Basil Polidoris' excellent score gives us a preview of everything to come. The music is adventurous, romantic, and even a little scary. And that the movie begins with a tiger roaring and the map being slashed by unseen claws. The Jungle Book's use of animal sounds in its sound design is on another level. There are very few moments throughout this movie where we are not hearing some sort of animal noises baked into the sound design. Even Mowgli makes animal sounds for the first chunk of the movie before learning English. And they say never to work with children or animals while making a movie, but the opening sequence of The Jungle Book proves that it can work. We open as a caravan moves through the jungle and we're introduced to Sam Neill's Colonel Jeffrey Bryden, who provides our opening and closing narration. And he introduces us to all of our main characters, including his daughter Kitty, their guide Nattu, his son Mowgli, and the always wonderful John Cleese as his close friend and physician, Dr. Plumford. Here it is set up that the tiger Shere Khan is angry at the caravan because men with guns, specifically Stefan Khalifa as Buldeo, is killing more animals than he can eat. This really makes Shere Khan angry. That night, Mowgli watches as Kitty waltzes alone to Blue Danube, and then tries to kiss her, and I have to give Sommers credit here because this scene actually works. Having the kids not deliver any dialogue and instead let it all be unspoken was the right call. But the main reason to bring this up is that it ends with Kitty tossing Mowgli a bracelet that once belonged to her mother. And the bracelet actually turns into a very minor but important prop as the movie continues, but more on that in just a bit. Shortly after this, Shere Khan arrives at camp and begins attacking and killing soldiers left and right, which of course causes mayhem and chaos, and this whole sequence lets us know up front that this isn't going to be some musical or feel like a kids movie. This is an action-adventure movie with death and explosions and live animals. This is a spectacle, and there is danger. I mean, Mowgli even ends up on this carriage that for some reason is carrying kerosene, and the carriage takes off after catching on fire, so we've got a boy and his adorable wolf cub riding through the jungle on a flaming carriage that's about to explode. I'm just saying, it's a pretty badass way to start your movie, that's all. So this sequence sadly ends with the death of Mowgli's father and Mowgli being stranded in the jungle. We're then treated to Mowgli's first day in the jungle, which is just a great little, mostly dialogue-free sequence that sees Mowgli meeting up with and befriending Bagheera, who somehow, without talking, acts exactly like his cartoon counterpart and leads Mowgli to the wolf pack, which is just one of the best looking shots in the movie. We've got a real wolf pack just hanging out and playing underneath a real waterfall. I know I say this all the time in my videos, but I just really miss when movies looked and felt real like this. This is a real location with real animals and you can tell, and I just love it. So the wolf pack adopts Mowgli and his puppy Gray Brother, and we then see Mowgli meeting and saving Baloo, who's stuck in a stump. But the best part of this is the passing of time montage that sees Mowgli, Baloo, and Gray Brother running through the jungle together, and we see them all become fully grown in front of our eyes. This is also our proper introduction to Jason Scott Lee as Mowgli, and I mean, look at the guy, he looks like he was carved out of marble. So one day, while Mowgli Mowgli's napping in a tree, his bracelet is stolen by a monkey. See, I told you the bracelet was important. And Mowgli follows the monkey all the way to Monkey City, which was filmed at the giant sound stages in Bombay. And I think this is my favorite set piece in the entire movie. I kind of love that we get two big sequences here, one at the beginning and of course one at the end. This sequence is also where Juan Anchía's cinematography really begins to shine. Everything about this sequence has a lush naturalism that also somehow feels heightened, which makes the story feel even more mythical and grand in scale. At Monkey City, Mowgli finds this jewel-encrusted dagger, and Louie forces him to fight Kaa, the only CGI character in the entire movie, from what I can tell anyway. And actually, Kaa isn't even pure CGI. There are several shots with a real green anaconda, and I believe there was also some puppetry going on here. The fight between Kaa and Mowgli is so excellent and comes at just the right point in the movie to keep all of us engaged. After winning the fight, Louie begrudgingly gives Mowgli his bracelet back. We then cut for the proper introduction of adult Kitty, played here by Cersei Lannister. I mean Lena Headey, who's only about 20 or 21 here, I believe. It's just so crazy to see her so young after her being Cersei Lannister in my mind for the past 15 years. This introduction is really fun because she and John Cleese get to banter back and forth, and it's clear that of these other students, Kitty is the bravest and smartest of them all. And we know this because she very bravely crosses this old bridge to go into the jungle by herself, even though no one really asked her to or seems to care that she's doing it. Here she re-meets Mowgli, though she doesn't quite put that together just yet. But she also meets Baloo, and we get this nice little scene of Mowgli and Baloo wrestling, and I really love this little wave that Baloo does as Kitty runs away, where she immediately bumps into our villain, Captain Boone, played by Cary Elwes. I just have to say, I think Elwes is so good at being the bad guy, whether it's in this, or Ella Enchanted, or Twister, or even as the mayor in Stranger Things. Elwes is just always great as an overly confident douchebag that you want to see get punched in the face. So anyway, Kitty bumps into Boone, he tries to kiss her, Mowgli thinks she's in danger and jumps in to help, and quickly embarrasses Boone, making him fall into the river along with two other men under Boone's command. We're also introduced to Boone's squeamish and cowardly right-hand man, Lieutenant Wilkins, played by Jason Fleming, who I mostly know from his work with Guy Ritchie. Guys, should I do a video on Snatch? I love Snatch. So Wilkins kinda sorta tries to shoot at Mowgli, grazing his arm, and Mowgli disappears back into the jungle. And this next shot has nothing to do with the story, but I do just want to call out that the next scene with Mowgli is the best looking moment of the entire movie, with him sitting with Baloo and Grey Brother. Apparently one of the reasons that Jason Scott Lee was cast in this role is because he was the most comfortable around the animals and vice versa. There's a lot of BTS footage of him petting and hanging out with the wolves, and it's so clear to me that that extra effort from him to be close with the animals paid off. It makes it feel like Mowgli really can communicate with animals. But the next chunk of the movie moves very fast. Mowgli sneaks into the palace where Kitty is living, and the whole thing feels very Aladdin to me, with the guards chasing Mowgli through the streets with various street performers doing stunts, the highlight of which is obviously the rope trick here. Once Mowgli arrives to Kitty's room, she notices the bracelet on his wrist and begins to put it all together. However, Boone and his men show up and the chase continues before Mowgli is finally caught and thrown into a cell. And here is where we meet Ron Donashie as Sergeant Harley. And so with Mowgli in their grips, Boone, Wilkins, and Harley now have the jewel-encrusted dagger and are grilling Mowgli about where he got it. So while these guys are busy torturing Mowgli, Kitty and Dr. Plumpton reveal to Colonel Bryden that the man locked up is in fact the boy Mowgli all grown up, which leads to a very long montage of Mowgli being civilized, big air quotes there, where he learns English, how to dress, how to dance, etc. This montage is also where he and Kitty very clearly begin to fall for one another for real, and the whole montage culminates with two great scenes. The first is Boone trying to intimidate Mowgli by showing him his collection of weapons, and he finally does get it out of Mowgli that he got the jeweled dagger from Monkey City. And it really is just a great scene with Mowgli understanding that the civilized world he's found him in is far from actually being civil. The next scene is the dance held at the palace, which sees Mowgli trying his best to fit in, only to be hurt by Kitty and Boone getting engaged and embarrassed by Boone's men pushing him into the dessert table. Finally, Mowgli has had enough of man's world and decides to return to the jungle. And because of this, Kitty gives the ring back to Boone, saying she won't marry him, which leads to her father insisting she move back to England by herself, which is just kind of weird and doesn't make much sense in my opinion, but whatever. Because once Kitty and her father and all her belongings are on their way to the ship to head to England, Boone, Wilkins, Harley, and Buldeo make their way through the jungle looking for Mowgli. Their first attempt to kidnap him does almost work, but he makes it away and is saved by Baloo, only for Wilkins and Boone to shoot Baloo. But don't worry, he doesn't die, but it's still sad. We then cut to see that Kitty, her father, and Plumpton are being attacked by Buldeo and his men, but then Boone steps out and reveals himself as the true villain, and that his plan is to use Kitty to get Mowgli to show him to Monkey City, which, to be fair, his plan does technically work. Once Mowgli finds Kitty, he agrees to go with the men and show them the city so long as they let Kitty go, which they agree to, and this group trekking through the jungle is also one of the highlights of the movie. First of all, you've got Wilkins losing his mind out of fear being in the jungle. Then we've got the death of Harley, which is one of the most traumatizing movie deaths of my entire childhood. Not quite T2 levels of trauma, but really not that far off either. I think it's the way you can see the quicksand staining Harley's teeth like he swallowed a bunch of it without meaning to. It feels very visceral, but also, I'm not gonna lie, it really makes me think about that John Mulaney joke about quicksand.
I always thought that quicksand was gonna be a much bigger problem than it turned out to be.
So Harley gets taken out by the quicksand, Wilkins gets taken out by Shere Khan, and Mowgli kicks this guy off a cliff. We're then down to just Boone and Buldeo as our bad guys, and these two successfully reach Monkey City, only for Buldeo to get taken out by the sandpit booby trap. And I still don't quite understand this trap, but the idea of being entombed in a sandpit is absolutely horrifying. Not quite as horrifying as quicksand though. As far as the highlights of this finale at Monkey City go, I think that Boone lighting the fire here is top tier, although apparently with this fire going, the temperature for this set would routinely reach upwards of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see how hot everyone is. Like, Cary Elwes hasn't been in the water yet, but he is soaking wet here. And the final duel between Mowgli and Boone is also really well done and choreographed, and I like that it culminates with Mowgli realizing none of the treasure is worth their lives. Craving the treasure is a curse that will kill you, and I like that the point is driven home with Kitty initially wanting to take some of the treasure before she and Mowgli leave. But once Boone echoes her own words back to her, she turns around and bolts through the door with Mowgli. Once these two leave, Boone is left all alone with the monkeys and Kaa, who scares the shit out of him, making him fall into the water. But the treasure on his back makes it so he immediately sinks, and before he can break free, Kaa eats his face. Yeah, it's pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. Once Mowgli and Kitty leave the city, they come face to face with Shere Khan, and here Mowgli gets to prove himself as being truly fearless and as the Lord of the Jungle. We get the reveal that both Baloo and Kitty's father are okay, and then Kitty and Mowgli kiss underneath the waterfall, and we get a nice little the end credit to take us out. So, over 30 years later, what is the legacy of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book? Well, like I said, it's been somewhat swept under the rug by Disney over the past couple of decades. At this point, they're more concerned with doing shot-for-shot remakes of their animated films and calling them live action, even though most of them might as well be animated, especially Favreau's version of The Jungle Book, and Lion King for that matter. The Jungle Book is a movie that I really just don't hear people talk about much these days. It has its fans though. Those of us that grew up with it on VHS, we think of it fondly, but it's rarely a movie that gets talked about by movie fans in any broad sort of way. And I think a big part of that is that this movie just isn't the most interesting part of anyone involved's career. Sommers would go on to make The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Lena Headey would go on to become forever linked to Cersei Lannister and Game of Thrones. And I mean, Cary Elwes is Cary Elwes. This isn't even his best movie from the early 90s. I did learn in doing research for this video that Jason Scott Lee has now been in 2 additional live action remakes, Mulan and Lilo and Stitch, so that's kind of weird. I haven't seen either of those movies and I probably never will, but ultimately the legacy of The Jungle Book is that it's a movie that's mostly been lost to time. There was no sequel, no remake of this story. No one involved ever seems to get asked about this movie either. Disney doesn't even have it on Disney Plus. It's just kind of a movie that now exists for those of us that grew up with it. And in all honesty, is that such a bad thing? If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching, and a special thank you to my patrons who produced this video. You all help make these videos possible. If you'd like to be credited as an executive producer or producer, you can find a link to the Patreon in the description below. Born to Rant is a completely independent channel, and I use absolutely no AI in the making of my videos. So please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We release new videos covering all of your childhood favorites every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.